Footsteps echoed outside the heavy titanium vault. The sovereign of 100 star systems trembled, leaning close to her lone human bodyguard. "Run," she whispered, offering him a single chance to survive the inevitable. He didn't run. He smiled, slammed his fist onto the lockdown console, and sealed them inside. The Grand Hall of Solitude on the planet Valerius was never designed for war. It was a masterpiece of alien architecture, a sprawling atrium built from crystalline spires and sweeping arches of spun diamond that caught the light of the system's twin suns. For 3 centuries, it had stood as a monument to the Valerian Empire's absolute dominance and peace. To Caleb Harper, a private security contractor from Aegis Security Solutions, it just looked like a giant greenhouse with terrible tactical cover. Caleb stood at parade rest, his heavy combat boots planted firmly on the polished obsidian floor. He was the sole human in a room filled with towering, luminescent beings. The Valerians were a beautiful, terrifying species, 7 feet tall, possessing an ethereal grace and skin that shimmered like polished pearl. By contrast, Caleb, a former Earth Coalition Marine born in the harsh concrete sprawl of Chicago, felt entirely inadequate in the aesthetics department. He was broad-shouldered, scarred, and clad in a General Dynamics heavy kinetic combat rig that made him look like a walking tank among swans. But Caleb hadn't been hired for his looks. He had been handpicked by General Nathan Briggs, the Earth Coalition's chief military liaison, to serve as the personal bodyguard to Queen Seraphina. Seraphina sat on the sun throne, a delicate crown of woven light resting upon her brow. She was a reformist, a ruler who had recently shocked her entire civilization by signing the Orion Treaty, opening trade and cultural exchange with the primitive, brutish humans. Her decision had made her a visionary to some and a traitor to others. Around the perimeter of the hall stood the Royal Guard. They were clad in ceremonial armor made of golden alloys, carrying energy halberds that hummed with latent plasma. They looked magnificent. They looked invincible. But Caleb's heads-up display, projecting data directly onto his retinas, told a different story. He was constantly scanning. His tactical AI was tracking heart rates, microexpressions, and energy signatures. For the last 20 minutes, the ambient tension in the room had been slowly, imperceptibly rising. Ambassador Eleanor Hayes, representing the human delegation, was currently at the podium, delivering a speech about the shared future of their species. Queen Seraphina listened with rapt attention, nodding graciously. But Caleb wasn't watching the Queen or the ambassador. He was watching Commander Gideon. Gideon was the captain of the Royal Guard, a highly decorated Valerian veteran of the Outer Rim skirmishes. He stood to the right of the throne, his posture perfectly rigid, yet Caleb's HUD highlighted a sudden, synchronized shift. Gideon's hand had moved precisely 2 inches closer to the activation stud of his plasma halberd. Across the room, 4 other guards mirrored the exact same microscopic adjustment. "They're shifting into a fireteam wedge," Caleb realized, his stomach dropping, inside their own palace. Caleb subtly tapped the comms unit on his wrist. "Command, this is Harper. I have irregular guard movements in the Grand Hall, requesting a sit rep on perimeter security." Only static hissed back in his earpiece. A local jamming field. The hair on the back of Caleb's neck stood up. He had seen this before during the Jovian campaigns. The sudden silence before the storm. The subtle realignment of asset. It was a textbook decapitation strike, being executed right in front of him. He took a slow breath, his hand dropping casually to rest on the grip of his heavy, standard-issue Earth Coalition sidearm, a massive hand cannon firing depleted uranium hollow point. The Valerians scoffed at human kinetic weapons, calling them barbaric, messy relics of a bygone era. They relied entirely on directed energy and thermal shielding. Caleb was perfectly fine with them underestimating his gear. Ambassador Hayes reached the climax of her speech. "And so we look to a dawn where our people stand together." A deafening crack shattered the serene silence of the hall. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of the Grand Hall's primary energy shield being violently disabled from the inside. The massive crystalline doors at the far end of the room exploded inward, showering the dignitaries in lethal, razor-sharp shrapnel. Chaos erupted instantly. Screams filled the air as the human delegation dove for cover under the marble tables. But the real horror wasn't coming from the breached doors. It was coming from the shadows of the throne itself. Commander Gideon ignited his plasma halberd. The blade roared to life, a blinding crescent of blue heat. He didn't point it toward the breach to defend his sovereign. He turned smoothly, his eyes locked onto Queen Seraphina with cold, calculated intent. For the purity of the Empire, Gideon boomed, raising the weapon. He swung the blade down toward the Queen's neck. He never completed the arc. Caleb moved. Human adrenaline, an evolutionary survival mechanism forged on a death world, dumped into his bloodstream in a massive, fiery wave. Before the Valerian guards could even process that the human had broken formation, Caleb had crossed the 10 feet, separating him from the throne. He didn't draw his gun. There was no time. Instead, Caleb launched his entire 220-pound armored frame directly into Commander Gideon's chest. The kinetic impact was devastating. Valerians were strong, but their bones were lighter, designed for agility in a slightly lower gravity environment. Gideon's ribs audibly cracked as Caleb's armored shoulder plowed into him, sending the towering alien flying backward down the crystalline steps of the dais. The plasma halberd clattered uselessly across the floor. "Contact! We have a localized coup!" Caleb roared, though his comms were still dead. He grabbed Queen Seraphina by the wrist, his heavy grip completely enveloping her delicate hand. "Move, Your Majesty!" Now, Seraphina was frozen, her wide, luminescent violet eyes staring in absolute horror at her own guards. The beings sworn to protect her from birth were systematically executing the loyalists in the room. Energy blasts scorched the beautiful diamond arches, turning the Embassy of Peace into a slaughterhouse. "Gideon?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the sheer impossibility of the betrayal. "Save the heartbreak for when we're behind a Lockheed Martin blast door," Caleb barked, forcefully yanking her forward. The sudden, violent motion snapped her out of her shock, and she stumbled after him. Their destination was the Aegis-designed panic room, located 70 yards behind the throne, a fortified bunker the Earth Coalition had insisted on installing as a condition of the human delegation's presence. The Valerians had mocked it as paranoid overkill. Today, it was the only thing keeping the Queen breathing. "Stop them!" Gideon shouted, rising from the floor, clutching his broken chest. "Kill the human! Take the Queen!" Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, superheating the oxygen and leaving a smell like ozone and burning copper. Caleb positioned his body between the Queen and the line of fire. His heavy kinetic armor took 2 glancing hits from plasma pistols. The ceramic plating dispersed the heat, but the sheer kinetic force felt like being kicked by a horse. Caleb grunted, keeping his momentum, dragging Seraphina toward the reinforced steel doors of the antechamber. 3 elite royal guards intercepted them, their golden armor gleaming. Caleb didn't break stride. He finally drew his sidearm. The weapon kicked like a mule in his grip. Boom, boom, boom. The deafening roar of primitive human gunpowder echoed over the high-pitched whine of alien energy weapons. The royal guards had personal energy shields designed to deflect lasers and plasma. They were completely unprepared for a half-inch thick block of solid, depleted uranium traveling at Mach 2. The heavy slugs tore right through their energy fields as if they weren't there, punching massive, catastrophic holes through their golden armor. 2 guards dropped instantly, blue blood pooling beneath them. The third stumbled back, staring in shock at the ruin of his chestplate before collapsing. Seraphina gasped, pulling back slightly in horror at the sheer brutality of it. Caleb ignored her reaction, shoving her through the heavy bulkhead doors and into the narrow, dimly lit antechamber of the panic room. He hit the wall panel to seal the outer door. The massive titanium slab began to slide shut, screaming on its hydraulics. But they weren't fast enough. Before the heavy door could completely seal, 4 more royal guards, led by a heavily armed lieutenant, threw themselves through the closing gap. They rolled into the antechamber, plasma blades igniting, illuminating the confined space in a harsh, deadly blue glare. The heavy outer door slammed shut behind them, sealing with a definitive hollow boom. The locking mechanisms engaged. They were now trapped in a space no larger than a wide hallway. Behind Caleb and the Queen was the inner vault door, the final barrier to absolute safety. In front of them were 4 elite assassins, blocking the only way back out. Open the inner vault, Caleb commanded, keeping his weapon trained on the assassins. Your biometrics, Majesty. Now, Seraphina pressed her hand to the inner console. It flashed green, and the heavy inner door hissed open, revealing a small, reinforced survival bunker equipped with a single human-sized emergency maintenance shaft leading to the lower subterranean levels. The Queen looked at the assassins, then at the inner vault, and finally down at Caleb. She saw the smoking gun in his hand, the scorch marks on his armor, and the stark reality of the situation. There were 4 of them. They were the finest killers the Empire had ever produced, bred for war and augmented for speed. Caleb was just one human. Her spirit, already fractured by Gideon's betrayal, finally broke. She realized what was about to happen. Her empire was gone. Her life was over. But she could at least spare the life of the strange, fiercely loyal creature standing between her and death. Seraphina stepped slightly behind Caleb, leaning down so her lips were near his audio receptors. "Run," the alien queen whispered, her voice laced with profound sorrow. She pointed a trembling finger past the inner door, toward the small maintenance vent. "It is built for human dimensions. They cannot fit. If you leave now, you can escape. My reign is over, Caleb Harper. Save yourself." Caleb didn't take his eyes off the 4 assassins, slowly advancing, their plasma blades humming in the confined space. He heard the resignation in her voice. He saw the assassins smirking, sensing their victory. They knew the human was outmatched in close quarters. Caleb slowly lowered his gun. The Valerian lieutenant laughed, a sound like grinding crystal. "Your pet is wise, Seraphina. Run, little primate. Hide in the walls." Caleb reached over his shoulder, his hand finding the heavy, manual lockdown lever beside the inner vault console. This was the emergency override, designed to permanently drop a solid block of tungsten over the vault entrance in the event of a catastrophic planetary assault. Once pulled, nothing could open it from the outside, and nothing could get in. But Caleb didn't pull the lever to seal the Queen safely inside. Instead, he grabbed Seraphina by the shoulders and forcefully shoved her backward into the inner vault. Before she could react, he stepped out of the vault, remaining in the antechamber with the 4 assassins. "Caleb! What are you doing?" Seraphina cried out, stumbling into the safe room. "Locking the doors, Your Majesty," Caleb said softly. He slammed his fist onto the external lockdown console. The alarms blared a deafening red. The inner vault door slammed shut, severing the Queen's horrified gaze from the antechamber. Heavy tungsten locking bars violently slammed into place with the force of an earthquake. The antechamber fell completely silent, save for the hum of plasma blades. Caleb was locked outside the vault. The outer door was sealed. The inner door was sealed. He hadn't locked the Queen in to protect her while he ran away. He had locked the doors to ensure the 4 assassins couldn't get to her, and more importantly, so they couldn't run away from him. Caleb cracked his neck, the sound loud in the tight space. He holstered his empty sidearm and slowly drew a serrated 12-inch high-carbon steel trench knife from his chest rig. "All right," Caleb growled, a feral, terrifying smile spreading across his scarred face as he looked at the 4 bewildered aliens. "I'm not locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me." The Valerian assassins hesitated. The sudden reversal of the psychological dynamic threw them off balance. In their culture, combat was a geometric, calculated art form. It was about posture, the elegant parry of energy weapons, and the clean execution of superior martial technique. What they were looking at now was something entirely outside their tactical doctrine. They were looking at an apex predator that had willingly trapped itself in a cage just to ensure its prey couldn't escape. "Kill the brute!" the lieutenant snarled, raising his plasma halberd. The 4 assassins lunged forward simultaneously, a coordinated strike designed to overwhelm the human in the narrow space. Caleb didn't retreat. He reached down and slapped a hard light flashbang grenade against the metal floor. The device detonated instantly. Unlike a standard human flashbang that relied on explosive concussive force, this Aegis-modified grenade released a localized burst of pure ultraviolet radiation and an ear-shattering high-frequency screech. To a human helmet equipped with auto-darkening visors and acoustic dampeners, it was a minor annoyance. To the highly sensitive ocular and auditory organs of the Valerians, it was devastating. The lieutenant shrieked, dropping his halberd and clawing at his face, as his vision went entirely white. Caleb surged forward through the blinding light. He didn't aim for the armor, he aimed for the joints. He ducked under a wildly swinging plasma blade from the second assassin, the heat of it instantly blister-burning the skin on the back of his neck. Ignoring the pain, Caleb drove his entire body weight upward, slamming the steel pommel of his trench knife into the underside of the assassin's jaw. The kinetic force shattered the alien's mandible. As the guard reeled backward, Caleb hooked his leg behind the alien's knee, sweeping him to the ground with a bone-rattling crash. Before the guard could recover, Caleb drove the high-carbon blade directly through the unarmored gap at his throat. 1 down, 3 to go. The cramped space was a nightmare of swinging plasma and flailing limbs. The third guard managed to blink away the blindness just in time to see his comrade fall. Roaring in fury, he thrust his halberd forward like a spear, aiming dead center for Caleb's chest. Caleb twisted his torso violently to the side. The plasma blade grazed his heavy chest plate, shearing through the ceramic composite like butter and searing a deep, agonizing line of burned flesh across his ribs. The smell of his own cooking blood filled the enclosed space. Instead of pulling away from the pain, Caleb leaned into it. He grabbed the scorching hot haft of the halberd with his left hand, the thermal heat melting the synthetics of his combat glove and blistering his palm. He held the weapon firmly in place, locking the guard in a grapple. "Too slow," Caleb hissed through gritted teeth. With his right hand, he buried his combat knife deep into the nerve cluster beneath the guard's armpit. The alien convulsed, dropping the halberd as his nervous system overloaded from the catastrophic kinetic trauma. Caleb ripped the knife free and used the dying guard as a meat shield just as the fourth assassin recovered and fired a burst from a plasma pistol. The shot struck the dead god's back, failing to penetrate the heavy golden armor, but the kinetic transfer pushed Caleb hard against the steel wall of the antechamber. He was breathing heavily now, the air in the small room growing hot and thin, thick with the stench of ozone, burned flesh, and copper. 2 left, the lieutenant and the pistol wielder. From inside the vault, Queen Seraphina was watching through the reinforced, one-way plexiglass viewport. She had her hands pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the surface. Tears of horror and awe streamed down her pale cheeks. She was witnessing a terrifying revelation. The Valerian Empire had always viewed humanity as fragile because their bodies lacked natural armor, their lifespans were incredibly short, and their technology relied on brute force kinetics rather than elegant energy manipulation. But looking at Caleb Harper, bleeding, covered in burns, his eyes burning with a manic, primal fire, she finally understood the truth. Humanity's strength wasn't in their biology. It was in their absolute, terrifying refusal to die. They were a species birthed on a chaotic, violent world, and when pushed to the brink, they didn't break. They became monsters. The lieutenant, now fully recovered from the flashbang, realized that honor and technique were useless here. This was a meat grinder. "Form up! Shield wall!" the lieutenant barked, shifting his energy shield to maximum output. He and the remaining guard locked their shoulders together, creating an impenetrable glowing wall of hard light that completely blocked the narrow hallway. They began a slow, methodical advance, pushing Caleb backward toward the solid tungsten door of the inner vault. They were going to crush him against the door or force him to burn on their plasma blades. Caleb had nowhere to go. His back hit the vault door. He could feel the vibrations through the metal. Commander Gideon had finally reached the outer door and was desperately trying to cut through it with heavy breaching equipment. Time was running out. Caleb looked at the advancing wall of energy. His sidearm was empty, his knife was useless against hard light, and he was bleeding heavily from his ribs and his burned hand. He smiled again. It was a bloody, awful smile. "Hey, ugly," Caleb rasped, his voice echoing in the tight chamber. "Do you know how a human kinetic shield works?" The lieutenant didn't answer, continuing his slow, lethal advance. "Yours are designed to deflect high-energy plasma," Caleb continued, reaching to the control module on his chest rig. "It repels heat. But human shields, we fight with bullets. Our shields don't repel energy. They violently expel kinetic force to shatter incoming projectiles." Caleb waited until the glowing edge of the Valerian energy shield was mere inches from his face. The heat was unbearable. He could see the triumph in the lieutenant's eyes. Brace for impact, boys, Caleb whispered. He slammed his fist into the emergency overload module on his chest rig. The General Dynamics kinetic armor didn't just activate. It violently purged its entire stored energy reserve in a single outward concussive shockwave. In an open battlefield, it would have knocked a man back 20 feet. Inside a sealed titanium box measuring 10 by 10, the overpressure was apocalyptic. The shockwave slammed into the Valerian energy shields. The opposing force is a shield designed to deflect energy, meeting a wave of pure, condensed kinetic pressure, resulted in a catastrophic feedback loop. A deafening crack ripped through the antechamber. The Valerian shields shattered like cheap glass, the emitters overloading and exploding outward. The immense kinetic shockwave hit the two aliens with the force of a speeding freight train. They were violently thrown backward, slamming into the outer steel door with a sickening crunch of breaking bones and collapsing armor. They crumpled to the floor, motionless, their bodies completely broken by the physics of the enclosed detonation. Caleb had taken the brunt of the recoil. The blast had slammed him backward into the tungsten vault door so hard his vision whited out. He slid down the heavy metal door, leaving a streak of red behind him, and slumped onto the floor. His ears were ringing so loudly he couldn't hear his own ragged breathing. His armor was cracked, his systems were completely dead, and he was fairly certain 3 of his ribs were fractured. Slowly, painfully, Caleb pushed himself up to a sitting position. He looked across the blood-soaked antechamber. All 4 elite royal guards were dead or permanently incapacitated. The impossible had been achieved. He painfully turned his head and looked through the thick plexiglass viewport of the inner vault. Queen Seraphina was staring back at him, her hands still pressed against the glass. She was shaking, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and profound reverence. Caleb raised his burned, trembling left hand and gave her a weak, trembling thumbs up. Suddenly, a loud, hissing screech echoed through the room. Caleb's head snapped toward the outer door. The center of the titanium slab was glowing a bright, angry orange. Sparks showered into the room as a heavy plasma cutter began to chew through the metal from the outside. Commander Gideon was almost through. Caleb groaned, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the floor. He leaned forward, ignoring the screaming agony in his ribs, and picked up a discarded plasma halberd from one of the dead guards. He used it as a crutch to haul himself back to his feet. He was broken. He was bleeding out. He was alone. But as the heavy outer door began to groan and buckle under Gideon's assault, the human guard simply tightened his grip on the alien weapon, planted his boots in the blood of his enemies, and waited for the next round. The bright, angry orange line of the plasma cutter continued its slow, agonizing crawl across the center of the heavy titanium slab. The metal wept glowing tears of slag, splashing onto the floor of the antechamber and filling the cramped, blood-soaked space with the acrid stench of vaporized steel. Caleb Harper leaned heavily against the inner tungsten vault door. His breathing was a wet, ragged rasp. His General Dynamics kinetic armor, designed to withstand the rigors of heavy urban pacification, was a ruined, scorched mess. The diagnostic readouts on his retinal HUD were flashing a kaleidoscope of critical warnings: catastrophic pressure loss in the chest plate, thermal breaches, and a severe drop in his own biological vitals. He didn't need a computer to tell him he was dying. His body was doing a fine job of screaming that reality into his brain. Using his unburned right hand, Caleb fumbled with the medical pouches on his tactical belt. He pulled out a heavy-duty trauma auto-injector. It was a proprietary cocktail developed by the Constellus Group, a real, private, military contractor back on Earth that had learned the hard way how to keep shattered men fighting during the resource wars. The syringe was filled with synthetic epinephrine, rapid clotting agents, and a highly classified neural blocker that temporarily severed the brain's ability to process non-critical pain. He jammed the needle directly into his thigh, bypassing the ruined armor plating, and hit the plunger. The rush of cold fire in his veins was instantaneous. His pupils dilated. The agonizing, suffocating weight in his crushed ribs vanished, replaced by a hyper-focused, synthetic clarity. His heart hammered against his sternum like a trip hammer. It was a temporary fix, a devil's bargain that would likely tear his cardiovascular system apart if he survived the next 10 minutes. But he only needed 5. Just like the old days, Caleb muttered. his voice sounding hollow in his own ears. He thought back to his time running security details in the radioactive ruins of Eastern Europe, operating under doctrines written by men who understood that survival wasn't about who hit the hardest, but who refused to stop breathing. He remembered the historical logs he'd studied at the academy stories of men like John Basilone, who held the line against impossible odds, with nothing but a machine gun and sheer, unadulterated refusal to yield. Humans didn't conquer the stars because they were the smartest or the strongest. They conquered the stars because they were the most stubborn entities in the known universe. The hissing of the plasma cutter abruptly stopped. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was dead silence. Then, a massive kinetic impact hit the outer door. The center of the titanium slab, structurally compromised by the extreme heat, bowed inward. A second impact. The heavy locking bolts sheared off with a noise like a bomb detonating. The massive doors blew open, crashing against the interior walls of the antechamber. Standing in the smoking breach was Commander Gideon. The Valerian captain was a terrifying sight. He was clad in personal command armor, a heavy platinum weave alloy that shimmered with an active, reinforced energy shield. In his hand, he held a heavy plasma broadsword, its blade burning with a heat so intense it distorted the air around him in shimmering waves. He stepped over the broken bodies of his elite guards, his luminescent violet eyes locking onto Caleb with a mixture of absolute disgust and seething fury. "You have ruined a masterpiece, human," Gideon said, his voice a perfectly modulated, terrifyingly calm resonance that echoed through the room. "The Valerian Empire has stood for 10,000 years. We are a society of order, of purity, of absolute symmetry. And Seraphina would trade our perfection to roll in the mud with animals like you." Caleb didn't say a word. He stood his ground in the center of the antechamber, the discarded plasma halberd held loosely in his burned left hand. His right hand hung near his hip, near the empty holster of his sidearm. "Look at you," Gideon sneered, taking a slow, measured step forward. His energy shield hummed, deflecting the ambient smoke. Broken, bleeding, propping yourself up with a weapon you barely understand. You think your primitive stubbornness makes you a warrior? It only makes your inevitable death more pathetic. From inside the vault, Queen Seraphina watched through the one-way plexiglass. She pounded her delicate fists against the impenetrable glass, screaming for Gideon to stop, to take her, and spare the human. But the soundproof seal of the vault rendered her cries completely mute. She was forced to watch the execution of the only being who had stood by her. Gideon lunged. For a creature standing over 7 feet tall and wearing heavy armor, the alien commander moved with terrifying liquid speed. He closed the distance in a fraction of a second, bringing the heavy plasma broadsword down in a devastating overhead arc, designed to cleave Caleb in half. Caleb didn't try to block it. He knew the kinetic force behind the blow would shatter his arms, even if the weapon didn't cut through him. Instead, utilizing the hyper-awareness granted by the Constella stim cocktail, Caleb dropped his center of gravity and threw himself flat onto the blood-slicked floor. The plasma broadsword roared through the empty air where Caleb's head had been a millisecond before, slamming into the heavy tungsten vault door. The heat of the blade scarred the indestructible metal, sending a shower of blinding white sparks cascading over Caleb's prone body. Before Gideon could recover his momentum and pull the blade free from the gouged metal, Caleb acted. He hadn't picked up the dead guard's plasma halberd to use as a spear. He had picked it up for its power source. During the agonizing wait for the door to be breached, Caleb had used his trench knife to pry open the weapon's casing, exposing the volatile, high-density plasma containment cell. Lying on the floor, Caleb kicked out with his heavy combat boot, catching Gideon behind the knee. The alien stumbled slightly but didn't fall. But the strike wasn't meant to topple him. It was meant to force him into a specific position. Caleb rolled, bringing the modified halberd up, and jammed the exposed, sparking containment cell directly against the heavy, localized shield emitter located on Gideon's platinum weave greave. "I don't need to understand your weapons," Caleb spat, blood bubbling on his lips. "I just need to understand basic physics." He slammed his armored fist into the containment cell's regulatory valve, completely shattering it. The resulting explosion wasn't a kinetic blast. It was an uncontrolled, localized plasma arc flash. The uncontained thermal energy violently interacted with Gideon's active shield emitter. The alien technology, designed to gracefully deflect directed energy, was completely overwhelmed by raw, chaotic power being injected directly into its matrix. A blinding sphere of blue-white lightning erupted in the confined space. The electromagnetic pulse instantly fried every piece of electronics in the room. The lights in the antechamber shattered, plunging the room into darkness, lit only by the dying, flickering sparks of the ruined armor and the emergency red glow bleeding through the breached outer door. Gideon screamed a high, piercing sound of absolute agony. The blast had completely overloaded his shields and fused his heavy command armor to his flesh. Worse, the thermal shockwave had catastrophically damaged his nervous system. The towering Valerian commander collapsed backward, his heavy sword clattering to the floor. He writhed on the ground, his body convulsing uncontrollably as his compromised nervous system misfired. Caleb lay on his back, gasping for air. The Constella stims were wearing off, and the crushing weight of his injuries was rushing back in like a tidal wave. His vision was tunneling, the edges turning dark and static. He couldn't feel his left arm. He tasted copper and ash. He slowly turned his head. Gideon was a few feet away, paralyzed, his beautiful face contorted in pain and disbelief, staring up at the smoking ceiling. "You," Gideon gasped, his voice barely a whisper, robbed of its resonance. "You are an infection, a plague of dirt and violence." "Yeah, well," Caleb wheezed, forcing a bloody smile. "Dirt is where things grow, buddy. Welcome to the garden." Suddenly, a new sound cut through the silence. It wasn't the hum of alien machinery or the hiss of plasma. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of magnetic boots locking onto the marble floors of the grand hall outside. Through the ruined outer door, beams of harsh, tactical white light sliced through the smoke. "Breach! Breach! Clear the fatal funnel!" A harsh, distinctly human voice barked over an external amplifier. A squad of Earth Coalition heavy assault Marines poured through the shattered entrance of the embassy, their heavy kinetic rifles raised, sweeping the room with disciplined, brutal efficiency. They moved like a well-oiled machine, completely ignoring the aesthetic beauty of the alien palace, focused entirely on establishing a secure perimeter. Behind them walked Ambassador Eleanor Hayes, her formal gown torn, flanked by two towering military medics carrying heavy trauma kits. "Clear!" a Marine shouted, stepping over the threshold of the antechamber, his rifle instantly locking onto the paralyzed form of Commander Gideon. "We have the hostile! He's down!" A medic rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside Caleb. "Harper! Christ alive! Son, stay with me! I need a medevac back to the Aegis Prime, right now!" "His chest plate is compromised. We have massive internal hemorrhaging." Caleb blinked, fighting to stay conscious as the medic began working frantically, tearing away the ruined armor to apply heavy-duty biofoam to his wounds. The vault. Caleb managed to croak out, pointing a trembling finger toward the inner door. "The Queen. Open it." Ambassador Hayes stepped forward. She pressed an override sequence into a heavy, decrypted datapad they had brought from the Coalition ship. The tungsten bars within the vault door finally disengaged with a heavy, metallic groan. The door hissed open. Queen Seraphina stepped out of the vault. The Grand Hall was dead silent. The human Marines, despite not being her subjects, instinctively lowered their weapons and stepped back, offering her the respect of the space. Seraphina looked completely different. The delicate, ethereal monarch who had sat on the sun throne hours ago was gone. Her crown of woven light had shattered during the escape. Her silken robes were stained with the blood of her loyalists, and her luminescent skin was covered in a fine layer of soot and ash. But as she stepped into the ruined antechamber, she radiated an aura of terrifying, absolute power. The veil of naive peace had been burned away, replaced by the hardened steel of a survivor. She had witnessed the dark, violent underbelly of the universe, and she had survived it. She walked slowly past the human medics, frantically working on Caleb. She paused, looking down at the battered, broken human who had defied physics, biology, and 4 of the deadliest warriors in her empire to keep her breathing. She knelt gracefully on the blood-stained floor. To the shock of her surviving subjects who were just beginning to secure the outer halls, the sovereign of the Valerian Empire reached out and gently laid her hand over Caleb's bloodied chestplate. "You did not run," she whispered, her voice filled with a reverence that transcended species. "Didn't have my running shoes on, Majesty," Caleb muttered before finally, thankfully, letting the darkness take him. Seraphina stood up. She turned her gaze to Commander Gideon, who was still paralyzed on the floor, looking up at her with terrified, wide eyes. The arrogance of the high society elite had been utterly stripped from him. He was no longer the magnificent captain of the guard. He was a broken traitor in the dirt. Seraphina did not scream. She did not express sorrow. The rebirth of her empire required strength, not pity. "Commander Gideon," Seraphina said, her voice echoing with the cold, absolute authority of a true monarch. "You sought to preserve the purity of our empire by executing its heart. You believed humanity to be fragile. Today, a single human shattered your elite guard, broke your invincible armor, and proved that true strength is not born of aesthetic perfection, but of the absolute will to survive." She looked up at Ambassador Hayes, extending a hand covered in ash. "The Orion Treaty stands, Ambassador," Seraphina announced, her voice carrying out into the Grand Hall for all to hear. "But there will be an addendum. The Royal Guard is disbanded, effective immediately. From this day until the end of my reign, the personal security of the Valerian throne will be managed entirely by the Earth Coalition." She looked back down at the unconscious Caleb as he was gently lifted onto a hover stretcher by the human medics. "And when he is healed," the alien queen declared, a fierce, protective light burning in her eyes, "that man will be their commander." If you enjoyed this HFY story about human resilience and absolute tactical dominance, please drop a like and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that share button to spread the story, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible sci-fi dramas, multi-part sagas, and original narratives uploaded every week. Your support helps keep these stories coming. Stay strong, stay stubborn, and I'll see you in the next video.